So the origin of my topic, museum realisms, if it doesn't work for you, you can blame Peter and Wayne. I met Peter last fall at a workshop at Stanford University in California, and I was giving a presentation on realism in more ethnographic historical contexts. And he said, oh, you should come to Leiden and be a fellow, and that worked out. And then suddenly, this phrase, museum realism, was stuck on top of my visit, and I thought, that's interesting. I've never thought about realism in museum contexts. Maybe I should try to see what that's about. And then I added the S, museum realisms, and here we are. We'll see. And I've been working with the idea, and I'm give you some preliminary results today. Thinking about realisms in museum context has so far proved fruitful to me, because museums offer excellent sites to explore ways of narrating and dramatizing diverse histories and ways of translating across cultures. And since they are performative contexts, museums keep us acutely aware of different audiences for the stories we tell. Can you all hear me? Good. The forms of realism that interest me involve a serious representation of social worlds, the people who make them, and the transformations they are going through. This is not, needless to say, a realism of origins and essences. It doesn't produce frozen diorama-like images of alterity. Do I need to mention Jimmy Nelson, whose dramatic, I would also add fantastic, photographs can be seen in the courtyard outside. In these staged images of pure original humanity, one looks in vain for a t-shirt or a plastic bucket, something unmistakably real. Let me begin by discussing realism today as I see it. These will have to be schematic remarks and a bit abstract, since I don't have time to get into a full discussion. Then I'll turn to illustrate some of the realisms currently and potentially at work in ethnological museums. Realism, as I conceive it, is obviously not reducible to empiricism, and it's not the philosopher's realism, an epistemological argument about whether and how much we can know something, anything, outside our symbolic and cognitive structures. Philosophers would probably call me a soft or a minimal realist. I accept that there are entities and worlds independent of my cognitive categories and modes of representation. Some of them can be known with quantitative, even mathematical rigor. But many phenomena, and those that primarily interest me, let's call them cultures, traditions, genders, social formations, traditions, patterns of belief, etc., these don't lend themselves to that kind of descriptive or taxonomic certainty. To work as a historian or an ethnologist, or indeed as a maker of coherent narratives in a museum exhibition, one relies on forms of representation that tend to be associated with literature rather than with natural science. The realist novel offers a good example with its ability to render richly detailed, multi-perspectival accounts of social situations, complex human dilemmas, and changing times. To theorize this kind of realism, I turn to the great literary scholars, Georg Lukács and Erich Auerbach. Their thinking offers a starting point, situated as it is in the early and mid-20th century, from which to update and diversify realism for use in contemporary decolonizing, globalizing worlds. I only have time today to suggest just a few key points, drawn from a longer analysis of Lukács and Auerbach, also enriched by reference to Mikhail Bakhtin around the question of multivocality. So I won't be able to say much about Lukács today, but just let me remark that his approach to the portrayal of character in the novel may well have something to teach museum curators who seek ways to present representative people in their exhibitions without reducing them to typicality or stereotype. This reduction was Lukács's criticism of naturalism. For Lukács, the great realists, Balzac, Flaubert, Thomas Mann, were not social documentarians. A changing society had to be grasped in its dialectical complexity through stories about untypical characters who enact in their unique experience the contradictory forces that are making and remaking their world. Thinking about realism in museums, I found myself wondering how those, quote, iconic objects and peoples, which are often featured in exhibitions or on posters, can be made to express this kind of complex historicity. I'm not sure how. The idea of a masterpiece, sometimes associated with them, doesn't help. There's little room there for contradiction or paradox. Lukács's critique of typicality is critical, I think, for the presentation of dynamic social and cultural realities. I'm less sympathetic to his strong rejection of modernist literature with its multi-perspectival strategies and formal experimentation. He had some famous arguments with Bertolt Brecht about these very issues, and I find myself coming down all on the side of Brecht. In this regard, I derive more help from Erich Auerbach's great literary history. The title is Mimesis, the Representation of Reality in Western Literature. Written in the early 1940s, in Istanbul, where Auerbach lived in exile from National Socialism, Mimesis is a tour de force of philological learning, spanning the entire Western tradition from the Bible and Homer through Dante's use of the vernacular to the 19th century novelists that Lukács saw as the epitome of historically rich, full realism. Auerbach, by the way, eventually migrated to the USA, where he taught at Yale and was a major influence on prominent critics such as Edward Said, Frederick Jameson, Hayden White, to name just a few. And unlike Lukács, whose sense of history and progress was stabilized by Hegelian Marxism, Auerbach wrote at the fraying end of a cultural tradition. In Istanbul, on the edge of the West, with Europe falling apart around him, he suggested in a poignant preface that Western synthetic realism could go no further, and that something new, something he couldn't quite grasp, was coming. This self-positioning in a contingent time and space has given me my starting point for extending and reinventing realism. Of course, history didn't stop in 1939. The post-war movement would bring processes of decolonization and expansive capitalism, forces that have decentered the former West in definitive and irreversible ways. A more complex, variegated realism would be needed to represent a world now inescapably fissured by region, gender, by race and ethnicity, by decolonial and neocolonial pressures. Unlike Lukács, Auerbach made room for multi-perspectival modernist forms of psychological realism. For example, his reading of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse at the end of Mimesis. Auerbach didn't know about forms of the novel and poetry that after the World War would be called Third World modernisms. His comparatism was entirely within the Occident. Let me focus on just one of these Third World modernist forms, so-called magical realism or marvelous realism, Lo Real Maravilloso of Garcia Marquez, Salman Rushdie, and many other writers. Magical realism freely juxtaposes fabulous and mythic forms with recognizable social and political histories. Dreams collide and collude with social satire. Formerly distinct, primitive, and civilized ways of thinking are contemporaneous, something that's particularly visible in the hybrid colonial Creole contact zones of Latin America. But such jagged realities are more and more familiar, aren't they, in the formerly central first world places? Do I need to mention a porous Europe? A porous Europe, or a USA that dreams of securing its lost identity by building phantasmic walls? Our political scene is a story worthy of Garcia Marquez, with Donald Trump perhaps as the general in his labyrinth, the title of one of Garcia Marquez's novels. The realism of magical realism goes deeper, however, than satire. to take it seriously, critics have pointed out that it actually represents and enacts in its form the experience of social development and culture contact in colonial situations. Marxist political economy offers another tool. You may be familiar with their concept of combined and uneven development. Development isn't a line like this with people taking off into modernity and so forth, but in fact it's a bit of a one step forward, two steps forward, one step back, or a more uneven process where overlapping modes of production, which don't follow each other in neat stages of development, feudalism yields capitalism, leads post-industrial capitalism, but in fact the different modes of production and socio-cultural formations overlap and coexist. In the Marxist theory, over time, these different overlapping, juxtaposed, they use the phrase articulated modes of production, will in the end be subsumed by the most modern, the most advanced forms of capitalism, but it will take time. But eventually, that subsumption, that process will occur. Everyone will become modern in the same way. But have they? Something else happened and is happening, something less like an arrow of history and more like a bush or tangle of histories, unfinished and open-ended. And I think that magical realism portrays juxtaposed, not assimilating social formations. And in that sense, it's more realist, I might say. This is a vision that is arguably truer to lived experience than those large-scale epical stories of progress or modernization. So we need to ask, what forms of realism, and magical realism is just one, what forms of realism, of performance and translation, can do justice to these hybrid historical conjunctures, both colonial and post-colonial? This, I think, is a fundamental question for ethnological museums today. They find themselves more and more articulating old and new culture, old and new art, not in the mode of stages of progress, but as performances of disjuncture, of questioning, of engaging with different audiences. Well, let's just look at a few images. This one, you'll recognize this from the Indonesia exhibition area here. And I really only used it to call attention to, and I'll come back to them, the giant projected images on the long walls that are now a signature of the Museum of the Form here, and which I find extremely interesting and seductive, almost too seductive because they detract me from looking at the objects. But that said, here you can sort of see, this is a very old piece, and then here's a street scene somewhere in Indonesia. And the visitor is simply asked to entertain the co-presence of these two times, without any explanatory transition. Well, this is magical realism, it seems to me, Another example, shall we say. Well, here's another one, those beautiful old Japanese bowls and tea sets and things, and then downtown Tokyo. I mean, they're both about Japan, but when you look at them as modes of history, as historicities, these are enormous leaps that people are being invited to make. And I think they should be invited to make them. I think these are good leaps, and I don't think they confuse people. I think people know that deep down that history is discontinuous. We could argue about that. Oh yeah, here's another one, familiar to you, I'm sure. This Melanesian guy who you meet on a landing in the Tropen Museum now, I gather he was somewhere else a while back, without any explanation. This is, of course, Roy, how do we pronounce his name? Villevoix, Roy Villevoix. A sort of Duane Hanson style artwork, hyper-realist artwork. Here's the one in the Lakanal Museum, which I think is in many ways very effective because it's obviously a Christian theme in the middle of some very old Christian old religious iconography. And this is a person out of place, from some other place, possibly some other time, who's posing a question without an answer. Or, this comes from the Africa Museum in Bergendal, in that one of the early gallery, which is of diasporic contemporary art from the Caribbean and Brazil, Afro-religious art projects. I mean, where or when is Africa? If you're asked to confront this. This may be confusing in a way, but I think it's a confusion that's worth having, because Africa is, of course, not a continent. It's a global process. It has its own relation to globalization and its own transnational histories and so forth. And to confront people with that and with their currency, I think is very important. So these are just some of the senses of a kind of juxtapositional historicizing that I want to make visible, and that I think ethnological museums have already been doing in their way, but perhaps without having theorized it. Johannes Fabian, in Time and the Other, condemned anthropology, as we all know, for keeping non-Western peoples in a different, earlier time, denying them coevalness. He didn't mean, however, that we all properly occupy the same time. His target was a residual evolutionism that froze people in the past. The contemporaneity, which for him defined the real, and where ethnology museums work, is an uneven meeting of historicities. When the focus is no longer exclusively on collections and thus on the past, these museums have to conjure with overlapping times, contemporaneous in different ways. Stephen Engelsman, and he's not the only one, speaks of a post-ethnological museum. I think I know what he means, and I'm ready to adopt the prefix, as long as we understand that post doesn't mean simply after, some whole new development. Post refers instead to something emergent, something we can't name yet. Post means following from, but with a difference, still very much entangled in the tradition it seeks to displace. So we're not talking about an epochal shift here, some whole new kind of museum. A couple of years ago, I gave an address to a conference at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, the culmination of a 3-year European project on the future of ethnographic museums. Some of you, I think, were there. I was worried then about what seemed to me a pervasive move toward art and away from culture. Many post-ethnological museums had been rebranding themselves museums of world arts and cultures. I now think the trend is more complex and less one-sided. Art is certainly the more fundable and commodifiable partner in what I once called the art-culture system. But ethnology museums, while making more space for contemporary art and artists, are not just turning themselves into art galleries with a global reach. They're becoming something more hybrid and potentially more significant as an access to interconnected local and global realities. Drawing critically on their ethnological tradition, these changing institutions are well placed to offer non-reductive visions of human possibility. Rather than an authoritative tour of the world's cultures, neatly circumscribed in time and place, they can explore really existing histories that connect, converse, and make trouble for each other. As performed and consumed in museum settings, ethnology has always been a mix of science and imagination, information and wonder, of order and disorder, of human difference and commonality. We talked in our discussion yesterday about the paradoxical relation of difference and commonality that is fundamental to the work that is done here. This paradoxical complexity is, I'm arguing, the Ethnology Museum's legacy and its way of engaging with dialectically complex realities. Now, this may be enough to suggest the kind of realism I think is needed today, a serious attempt to render historical moments and sociocultural ensembles. This was always Lukács and Auerbach's project, but in a significantly different world. It may explain why I'm never satisfied by single stories and perfectly coherent images. See how we're doing here. Now let me try to do more than just evoke the post and try to historicize the conjuncture in which ethnological museums are struggling to reinvent themselves. Very roughly, there are here are my three moments, which I invite you to think of as overlapping and as three forms of realist representation. I'm not wedded to these names. They'll just have to do for now. In 1960, and in the years prior to that, ethnological museums were still very much places that owed their collections to 5 centuries of Euro-North American expansion. In the late 19th and early 20th century, during the period of so-called salvage collecting, which was premised, as we know, on the disappearance or modernization of many non-Western societies, a disappearance that has been happening over and over for hundreds of years, I point out, and yet there's still someone there to disappear. Jimmy Nelson, take notice. Sorry, excuse me, I have a bee in my bonnet, as you can see. I have an obsession. During this period of salvage collecting, the pace of acquisition accelerated. The ethnological museum that followed understood its task within a realist historical narrative that saw Westernization as inexorable and destructive. Museums would be retrospective caretakers of the world's cultures, archives of difference. They would organize diversity according to scientific, anthropological categories such as evolutionary progression, region and local culture, topics of comparison like religion, ritual, kinship, reciprocity, food production, etc. I think we can all recognize the persistence of these meta-theoretical, meta-historical, and taxonomic strategies in today's museums, though much has changed and is changing. The habit of thinking archivally is hard to break. Recently, I was just recalled a telling phrase from Clifford, whose interpretive anthropology did so much to prepare the way for my second moment. This concluding sentence comes from his famous programmatic essay called Thick Description. It introduced his book, the seminal book, The Interpretation of Cultures, in 1973. The sentence goes like this: "The essential vocation of interpretive anthropology," he had said, "is not to answer big universal questions, but instead, quote, to make available to us answers that others have given, and thus to include them in the consultable record of what man has said." It's this last phrase that I want to underline, the consultable record of what man has said. It expresses the common sense of an archival attitude that doesn't worry too much about the us or who the others are, and it's not concerned with what their different attitudes and unequal access to the consultable record of what man has done might be. A lot would change in the 2 decades after 1973, and so did Gertz's thinking. His universal pronoun man would yield to more specific gendered idioms of humanity, and the retrospective disposition of the culture collector, what man has said, would be replaced by a curatorial interest in what people have said and are saying and doing. Such questions emerged during my second moment, after the late 70s, when critiques of museum practice became common. I don't think I need to rehearse all of the work that brought reflexivity and awareness of neocolonial power into view across a range of disciplines, eventually including museums. Johannes Fabian, Edward Said around 1980, followed soon by the collective work Writing Culture in Anthropology, itself followed by Women Writing Culture and a series of other responses. This legacy of critique is very much with us still. It's been simultaneously an analysis of power inequalities and of modes of representation. Right now at the Tropen Museum, there's a Decolonizing the Museum project, which interjects critical analyses on colored placards in many of the exhibition spaces. And then the inevitable backlash, a wariness of political correctness, or the epistemological worry that postmodernism, by which is usually meant post-structuralist theory, will somehow leave us with a nihilistic inability to distinguish better from worse accounts of reality, will undermine humanist commonalities, or worse, will devolve into so-called navel-gazing. That's a favorite. I've been accused of navel-gazing so many times. Maybe that's why I'm reaching for realism. My own return to realism does come after post-structuralism and after political and cultural critique. It seeks to move on, but without dismissing their insights. Reflexivity did, in fact, teach us a lot about ourselves in analytic realist modes. It was always about co-constructed knowledge, not mere subjectivism. Maybe a few more images. This comes from the Rotenstraat Joost Museum in Cologne, which is the most rigorously self-reflexive ethnological museum of my knowledge. Well, it was preceded by a famous one in Neuchâtel back in the day, which was so reflexive and critical that it had almost Dadaist dimension by a brilliant director, Jacques Hénard. Does any of you remember the Neuchâtel Museum? It was a brilliant thing, but one was happy there was only one. and I'm sort of happy there's only one Rotenstraat Joost as well. But it's brilliantly done, I think. And this is a room right near the start where the museum itself is on display, and its collecting and taxonomic procedures, are shown. For example, all of these spheres and things, they're all labeled by acquisition numbers, I mean, they're referring to the museum process, not to the use of these objects in their original site or anything like that. And they have an exhibition about stereotypes, a box that you go into, and you're sort of enclosed in your own horrible mentality, think with stereotypes, stereotype phrases and images projected on the walls, but they have these doors, and if you open the door behind the stereotype, in this case it's about, the non-Western peoples are childlike, you open the door and inside there's somebody talking to you who's not childlike and is telling you about the stereotype. Very clever museographic techniques that are used there. So, but these is very critical, reflexive stuff that is active there. At the Africa Museum, early on in the process, you'll be taken through a section where you're asked to reflect on your own way of looking, our way of looking. There's a section on an idea of beauty. Why is African art beautiful? Well, because Picasso thought it was beautiful, in part. And so we get the Picasso moment of recognition where the Grebo mask looks like surrealism. It looks like cubism, to him. And surrealism and oceanic art and, that whole story. But they put that up front in the museum. Or even here, I didn't see a lot of reflexivity in the Volkenkunde Museum, but as I was going down a back staircase, and I was taken around by the curators, it was almost like an archaeological discovery. I saw the remnant of another museum, which was this photograph, a series of photographs of tourists taking pictures of native peoples, which I thought was, whoa. So, in any event, I think we need to integrate critique and reflexivity, but not necessarily in this in-your-face way, but often quite subtly and lucidly in our storytelling. Decolonization has made a difference, and it continues to do so. And so has post-structuralism. After Foucault, Barthes, Walter Benjamin, Hayden White, realism will never be the same again. There's no going back to the realist master histories of modernity, progress, etc., the easy invocations of humanism. These needed to be challenged, and they still need to be put on the defensive. But not just theoretically. An older homogenizing realism has also been displaced by historical actors who in practice question Eurocentric inevitabilities. New publics emerge, entering the museums, and not just in the form of sculptures. For me, this has been part of a process of awakening to what I've called indigenous presence, to the transnational mobilizations and visibility of small societies, who in the past have been surviving, often with great difficulty, but more or less out of sight, but which now, it's a bottom-up aspect of globalization in part, are turning up in European and Western other museums and asking to see their stuff, and having something original and new and different and authentic to say about that stuff. So we all can give, I think, plenty of examples. For me, the existence of Indians on Cape Cod was a revelation to me in Massachusetts. I thought they were all gone. And I wrote an essay in Predicament of Culture about the Mashpee Indians on Cape Cod, and I've really spent the next 20 years trying to unpack that one essay. Then in the basement of the Portland Museum, I was asked to be a consultant in a context where Tlingit Northwest Coast Indian elders were brought to interact with the Rasmussen collection, a great collection of their art that was held in the Portland Museum. And instead of being interested in the objects and what their function was, they were interested in the stories and the songs and the political discourses that were evoked by the objects. In other words, the object was the least of it. It was about culture, politics, society. That was the realism of those objects. And that was a revelation to me, to be in that basement and to see the museum curators learning from these elders. I used that as the beginning of this essay of mine called Museums as Contact Zones. It opened up the idea of a museum as more than a final resting place for objects, but as a place where different people come and tell different stories and have different experiences. That vision of a museum. You may know about Anne Fina Brearden has written books about the Yupik Eskimos going to the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, doing similar things. I recently reviewed a grant from the Vienna Weltmuseum about some co-curation projects that they're having with Amazonian Indian groups there, based on a great Amazonian collection that they happen to have. All over Canada, USA, Australia, New Zealand, Aotearoa, these ongoing relationships with the so-called source communities and their diasporas are going on. People who didn't disappear, but changed. People telling old and new stories about collections, making their contents live again in new situations, in globalizing relations of tension and possibility. I might add to this vision of contact and expansion, online access to collections, the digital dimension to all of this, of which a whole lecture could certainly be given, more than one lecture. At the Museum of Anthropology in Vancouver, a place that I have frequented, the so-called Reciprocal Research Network links the museum and its collection to other museums in Canada and to several tribal centers, cultural centers. There are complex protocols in many of these networks of access and management. In Australia, for example, where certain things can be seen by initiated women or men, others by not by the uninitiated. Things like this start to matter, and the reciprocal relations in the digital space get complicated in, I think, very interesting ways. How are we doing? I'm coming to the last bit. Realism in ethnological museums, I've argued. We're now in my final, the reconstructive, just so you remember. We're already, you can tell, in my final phase. These really weren't stages. They were overlapping moments. And by the way, the early archival documentary moment has not disappeared. It has not lost its relevance by any means. That kind of work in museums of older modes of curating, preservation, research, absolutely have to be maintained, but they're not the only or the only raison d'etre, let's say, of the museum now. That's why I think I'm always, you can see that my mode is always, there will be always 2, probably 3 stories going on at the same time. Whether you curators have the luxury to do that kind of thing is something you have to have in discussions, and especially with your managers. It's too complicated. I'll come to that in a minute. I've argued that realism in ethnological museums is about the complex, non-reductive presentation of changing and interacting human cultures, societies, and people. This is not about collecting human essences, but rather by looking at and listening to others, we can wonder about ourselves. In the last section, I'm simply going to touch on several areas of actual and potential realist practice within ethnological museums. The first I'm calling realisms of juxtaposition. And I've already talked about that in the context of magical realism and this kind of ability to move discontinuously between different historical moments in time. And also veering between the mythic, the descriptive, the dreamlike, the satirical, and the historical. We've shown how at the Africa Museum, by having contemporary diasporic Caribbean artists nurtured by Santeria, Vodun, Candomblé, having those artists up front has, I think, really made people confront an inability to look at African objects as old things from Africa that, either have a cultural function or are great primitive art, as recognized by Picasso or more nowadays by Jacques Chirac and people like that. Where is Africa? It's no longer a place of dark primitivity and fascination. Rather, it's a cluster of stories about migration, about capitalism, colonization, slavery, diaspora, contemporary arts, musics, religions, and now, more urgently, and this is true of many areas, environmental issues. These juxtaposed stories travel and are more than local. So in my realism, I call them big enough stories. Not big stories and not little local stories, but something important enough in between to merit the term of realism. They can't be smoothed over into a whole. Stories in museums interrupt each other, and I think they should. Interruption. I mean, just those wall projections are really, I don't know if you've done a lot of thinking about them, but they really have caught my attention. I mean, here's a case. I think we're in Amazonia here, am I right? And here's where we have some small artifact carved or created at when, I'm not sure. And then on the back, that. How do people process this disjuncture? That interests me. Or those people looking at you. Here you are looking at things African, and here are these people looking at you. Well, what does that do for the experience of the museum goer? I mean, you might say, oh, well, they're charming, they're lovely people, and you could consume them as almost like art objects. Or they could function as actual people with agency looking at you while you're looking at them. I don't know. These are questions and that curators, I think, ought to be thinking about. Probably are. I assume you are. We'll get to that. So that was realisms of juxtaposition. The second I'm calling dialogical realisms, and this has to do with the relationships with audience that are ineluctable in museums. The question of the audience is integral to the performative realism that I'm interested in. Museums always have to be asking what the viewer is getting, what the visitor is getting. And as we know, the actual good empirical information about the viewer is pretty thin in museum work. There's very little in-depth work. Very little in-depth work, with some exceptions. Anne-Marie here at the Amsterdam Museum is doing something work on prostitution that puts the audience response, makes that integral to the exhibition itself. And I think that's a very interesting development, but rather rare. My confrontation with this issue happened at the in the Musée du Quai Branly. This is the infamous or famous plateau d'exhibition, the permanent exhibit at the Quai Branly Museum. I was one of the first people when it opened who denounced it. I didn't denounce the whole museum project. I thought there were other interesting things, but this looked to me like, neo-primitivism of the most sort of mystical, and it failed my realism test. Even the flexible and expanded realism that I've been pushing so far. There was no history anywhere here. It was all atmosphere, all experience, all drama, all theater. But then I was confronted by the fact of its popularity. People love it. So I've had to worry about that. The Quai Branly commissioned two young researchers, Octave de Barry and Mélanie Rouston, to do an in-depth survey of the plateau, and that's a very interesting text called Voyage au Musée du Quai Branly, which is published by the museum. And they spent a lot of time following people around, interviewing them, getting a sense of it. And I learned a lot from that, actually. People, yes, neo-primitivism, yes, they thought they were going to the sources of humanity in this mystical place. They liked the anti-didactic element of it, They liked the fact that they could get lost there. And they were smart people. They knew that there was colonization. They knew there were these histories that weren't being told. It didn't bother them in the interviews. I couldn't really dismiss their experience, but then again, I couldn't really salute it either, because it is a very effective neo-primitivism, and the dehistoricizing dimension of it all did bother me. But it made me wonder whether there were not ways that call them the uses of enchantment, of wonder in a museum that might be turned to different ends, to tell different stories. That we shouldn't just think that, make us really think about the museographic effects of wonder, of experience, of theatricality in museums, and of performances. I mean, museums where indigenous people are involved are much noisier places, by the way, now than museums used to be. And that's interesting, good, I think. Well, I want to just leave you with what I think of as a very positive example from Quai Branly. This is just an example of wonder in the plateau d'exhibition, getting lost. It's very hard to find any labels or any contextualizing information. We don't do. Stéphane Martin, the president, says we don't do context. You, the priests of contextualization, he calls you. We do theater. Oh, okay, but no, this was I think, arguably the best exhibition that Quai Branly has done. It was a couple of years ago. It's about New Caledonian history, culture, artifacts. Two curators, one a Kanak from New Caledonia, Emmanuel Casirero, and another curator Roger Boulet, who spent a lot of time out there and collaborated. Casero went all over Europe and found New Caledonian artifacts. I'm sure he came here. And he brought some of them to this exhibition. But what was really interesting about the exhibition was its design. First of all, you can see l'art est une parole. Art is a parole. And parole is a very complicated translation term, which I won't go into. But even the fact that it's said in that way in a declarative sentence already invites the visitor to a translation experience. You know, this is going to be about translation. And it is. In rather rigorous and demanding ways. By the way, it was a very popular exhibit, very well attended. But what was most interesting among many things in here to me was a complex dual structure that they set up. There were each curator was responsible for different aspects of the show, which were then braided together, you know, not two separate sections, but alternating in and out, but in ways that were clear so people could know when they were in one or the other. And one was called visage, and the other called reflet. And visage, mostly curated by Casero, was a kind of ahistorical Kanak sense of who we are. Who we were then and who we are now, you know. And reflet, mostly curated by Boulet, was historical. And it had lots of information on French colonization, the penal colony, missionaries, French exoticism, you know, cannibal imagery, so-called, all that kind of thing. And these two things were braided together, and the argument of the exhibition was that being Kanak today involved both. A sort of ahistorical, almost mythic sense of who we are and who we have been and have always been, you know, on the one hand, and these violent, disruptive historical changes that have also made us. And the visitor was not asked to pick one or the other or say one is myth and one is realism. They were both, in my sense, is the realism of this show was that it asked the visitor to entertain two ontologies, two senses of the real at the same time. And now, so my question was, did no one tell Casero and Boulet, you can't do that, it's much too complicated, you're going to confuse your visitors. Well, I've always wanted to give a talk called Against Simplification. But I can't do that because it's too simple. Complexity, too, has its own problems, as any museum manager will remind us. But I do think that with lucidity and transparent organization, one can engage paradox, even contradiction. We can't be afraid to challenge our audiences to think, to entertain multiple perspectives and voices. Of course, only some will get it. That's true of every exhibition, however lucidly put together. And simply, some will get it, others will go their own way, as usual. Okay, I think I've run out of time, so I think I'll just cut to the chase. I had a section on neo-exoticism, and this is a question Wayne has raised, is there an ethical way to use exoticism in museums? And we're going to I was going to invoke Peter Pels, and I think we'll just let him discuss this question. So a final thought, museum realisms. I've been suggesting these are not just, I have to prepare this, excuse me. My last section was about realism of historical process and transformation. And there I've told stories about, based on the involvement, the engagement of Indigenous people today with their own collections, with their collections, and with their heritage in ethnological museums. And I draw on an essay by Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett, who gave the inaugural lecture, I believe, in the Fell series, brilliant and wonderful figure, is about how museums have gone from culture or science and anthropology to being about heritage, and that heritage, in her view, is not about the past, it's about, heritage is always using the past in order to move forward, to go somewhere else. She talks about the second life of heritage. And the second life of heritage is going on in museums, ethnological museums, I think, a lot, all the time. Some ethnological museums are now collecting new native art and material culture. It's a hard sell, I know, in many places, but a number of them are now doing that. And in this way, they support cultural flourishing and are more than just documentary records or memorials to vanishing traditions. Telling stories of heritage renewal of old and new objects and peoples can open up visitors' imaginations about authenticity and what is historically possible. And a final thought. Museum realisms, I've been suggesting, are not just, though, rich images of historical process. They represent change from within change, responding to the fact that museums are themselves challenged and adapting to new circumstances, forging new relationships. It's this reflexive and dialogical reality which makes ethnological museums, or however they chose to rename themselves, that makes them exciting places, good places, for me at least, to think about performing realism today. Thank you.